Today, we're opening a door to a place you likely visit every single day, but you probably rarely evaluate it in terms of, high stakes, legal and scientific drama. We're looking right inside your medicine cabinet.
Yeah, it is a surprisingly intense place, historically speaking. When you peel back the layers of how those bottles actually get to you, the landscape is incredibly
It
complex.
really is. And that price gap we see in the pharmacy aisle, it just defies basic
Yeah,
economics. I mean, picture your last trip to buy something for heartburn. You see Prilosec, the brand name, sitting on the shelf for maybe 89 cents a pill.
right, and right next to it.
On the very next peg, exactly, is omeprazole, the generic equivalent sitting there for 64 cents a pill. It's the identical main ingredient, the exact same dosage, and it initiates the same biological mechanism in your stomach.
Yet the brand name is 40% more expensive.
Right. And if we look at the broader market, generics are, on average, 75% cheaper than their brand name counterparts. So
Yeah.
if the chemical is identical, what are we actually paying for?
That is the big question.
And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We're going to uncover the 60-year history of drug pricing, patent law, and FDA regulations. We need to figure out exactly why this happens and how a chemical can legally be owned in the first place.
What's fascinating here is that modern drug pricing isn't just a simple narrative of corporate greed. I mean, that's often the immediate reflexive assumption people make.
Sure.
Reveal a deeply tangled web. We are looking at an infrastructure built over decades in response to fatal safety tragedies, heavily exploited legal loopholes, and deeply rooted human psychology. The concept of intellectual property in medicine has just fundamentally mutated over the last century.
To understand that mutation, we need to establish the baseline. Because if you were navigating the healthcare market in the early 1900s, the landscape was basically bifurcated. On one side, you had ethical medicines. These were drugs the medical establishment recognized as having a documented pharmacological effect, things like quinine or aspirin.
And on the other side, you had patent medicines.
Yeah.
This is the literal origin of the term snake oil salesman.
Wow, really?
Yeah. The creators of these concoctions were marketers, not biochemists. The formulas were proprietary secrets, heavily relying on alcohol, opium, or just sugar water. They were massive commercial successes, but they possessed absolutely zero therapeutic value.
I think the terminology itself is what trips people up there. In that era, the word patent in patent medicine implied a trademark or a royal endorsement. It wasn't a scientific patent as we understand it today.
Precisely. Intellectual property laws regarding pharmaceuticals were incredibly murky at the turn of the century. A pharmaceutical company could not easily patent the base active ingredient. The legal framework didn't really allow someone to own a naturally occurring or broadly synthesized compound.
So they just own the name.
Exactly. They could only lock down the brand name. The classic case study is Bayer in 1899. They started marketing a medicine containing acetylsalicylic acid. In 1900, they secured a U.S. patent for their specific brand name, aspirin.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that means the earliest iteration of the pharmaceutical industry actually ran on a de facto generic model.
Essentially, yes.
If Bayer only owned the trademark for aspirin, any computing laboratory could synthesize the active ingredient, slap a different label on the bottle, and sell it completely legally.
They could, and they did. It was standard practice. The paradigm didn't fundamentally shift until we moved into the 1930s. At that point, biochemistry advanced rapidly, and scientists began isolating and synthesizing a tidal wave of novel compounds.
Like what kind of compounds?
Insulin, adrenaline, the early antibiotics, really life-saving stuff, and the legal interpretation adapted to the science. If you were the first laboratory to isolate and define a novel molecular compound, you could secure a patent on the molecule itself.
Wow. Granting you a temporary absolute monopoly,
Right.
which introduces an obvious ethical tension. Because if a company holds the exclusive rights to a compound required to keep a human being alive, their pricing leverage is infinite.
It is.
The ethos of the 1930s scientific community was vastly different from modern biotech capital.
The contrast is profound. Today, the skyrocketing cost of insulin is a central point of debate in American healthcare. But look at Frederick Banting, one of the original discoverers of insulin. He operated under a strict moral imperative.
It was he too.
He famously declared, "Insulin belongs to the world, not to me," and he sold his patent to the University of Toronto for a single dollar.
$1. That's incredible.
Just to ensure production could scale immediately without prohibitive licensing fees. Jonas Salk adopted a similar philosophy with the polio vaccine, refusing to patent it because he viewed the public health benefit as paramount. Imagine how radically different our current medical infrastructure would look if that prioritization of altruism over monopoly had remained the governing principle.
That altruistic ethos is inspiring, but relying on the moral compass of individual chemists doesn't build a safe regulatory framework. Good intentions didn't stop the system from producing fatal errors.
No, they didn't.
The government essentially operated with a hands-off approach until a specific catalyst forced their hand.
And that catalyst was the 1937 Massengill elixir tragedy. The Massengill Company was attempting to expand the market for a powdered antibiotic called sulfanilamide. They tasked their chemists with formulating a liquid version for easier dosing.
Which sounds simple enough.
Right, but the powder resisted dissolving in standard aqueous solutions. So the chemists utilized a solvent that worked perfectly, diethyl glycol.
A chemical that most of our listeners would immediately recognize as the primary toxic component in commercial antifreeze.
Yes, they literally shipped this toxic syrup nationwide, resulting in the agonizing deaths of over 100 people, many of them children.
That is just heartbreaking.
It was, and the subsequent fallout exposed a staggering regulatory void. Under the laws of the time, the federal government struggled to even penalize Massengill for distributing a lethal poison.
Wait, how is that possible?
The only viable enforcement mechanism was a labeling technicality. Massengill had branded the product an elixir. In pharmacological terms, an elixir explicitly implies a solution utilizing ethanol.
Oh, I see.
Because they used diethyl glycol instead, the company was prosecuted strictly for misbranding.
That failure of federal oversight is what birthed the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That established the modern foundation of the FDA, requiring manufacturers to submit a new drug application, an NDA, demonstrating some baseline evidence of safety.
Right. Some evidence.
But reading through the historical documents, the initial implementation had a massive glaring loophole. If the FDA failed to process and formally reply to an application within 60 days, the drug was automatically approved by default.
It was a wildly deficient system reliant on an understaffed agency, and it required a second global catastrophe to finally close that loophole.
The thalidomide disaster.
Exactly. In the late 1950s, the West German pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal heavily marketed a sedative called thalidomide. It became a global blockbuster, particularly prescribed to pregnant women for morning sickness.
Right.
By the early 1960s, the horrific teratogenic effects became undeniably apparent. Over 10,000 infants across Europe and the UK were born with severe deformities, primarily phocomelia, which presents as severely shortened or absent limbs.
The thalidomide disaster is widely known, but the untold story here is how the United States largely avoided it. It came down to a single pharmacological reviewer at the U.S. FDA, Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey.
Dr. Kelsey's contribution to modern medicine cannot be overstated. When the thalidomide application hit her desk, she simply refused to greenlight it. She found the clinical safety data provided by the manufacturer completely inadequate and withstood intense corporate pressure to push it through.
And as a crazy historical footnote, Dr. Kelsey was actually part of the research team that identified the antifreeze chemical in the 1937 Massengill poisonings.
She was. Her localized embargo of thalidomide in the U.S. provided the undeniable political leverage required to pass the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments.
And this is the legislative pivot that changes the economics of pharmaceuticals forever. Because the amendment dictated that drugs must not only be proven safe, but they must also be proven effective for their marketed use through rigorous, randomized, double-blind clinical trials.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the demand for verifiable efficacy radically altered the financial timeline of drug development. Prior to 1962, pushing a drug from laboratory discovery to market approval took an average of 2.5 years.
Pretty fast.
Very fast. Following the Kefauver-Harris mandates, that timeline expanded massively, jumping to anywhere from 7 to 13 years of clinical testing.
The patent clock doesn't pause for the FDA. If a company patents a molecule on day one to protect their intellectual property, they're granted a 17-year monopoly. If the new clinical trial requirements consume 13 of those years.
The manufacturer is left with only 4 years of exclusive market time to recoup a decade of research and development costs.
Which is a huge financial hit.
Exactly the issue. The unintended macroeconomic consequence was a severe chilling effect on pharmaceutical innovation. The risk profile became too steep, and the pipeline of novel drugs slowed drastically. So to counterbalance this, regulators introduced the abbreviated New Drug Application, or NDA.
The generic shortcut.
Right. It was designed as a regulatory shortcut for generic manufacturers. If a pioneer company had already exhausted a decade, proving a specific molecule was safe and effective, the generic company was not required to duplicate those human trials. They merely had to provide a literature review demonstrating their product was a chemical copy.
Which initiated a bitter, multi-decade war between pioneer pharmaceutical companies and generic manufacturers. The pioneer companies recognized the existential threat to their profit margins. So they launched aggressive lobbying campaigns targeting the primary gatekeepers of that era, the doctors.
Yes, because in the mid-20th century, the prescribing physician had absolute authority over brand versus generic substitution.
And the brand name manufacturers use highly sophisticated psychological marketing. They deliberately branded their proprietary drugs with concise, memorable names, leaving the generics tethered to their polysyllabic, complex chemical nomenclature.
It was a very effective strategy.
By 1938, a physician attempting to prescribe the basic cardiac medication digitalis had to navigate an exhausting menu of proprietary names. You had Digicardalis, Digipit number 2, Dearasmith.
Those are ridiculous.
My personal favorite is Digitora. Sounds like a Pokemon. Furthermore, the pioneer companies successfully lobbied state legislatures across the country to enact anti-substitution laws.
Right.
If a physician explicitly wrote Digipit number 2 on the prescription pad, the pharmacist was legally banned from dispensing a cheaper generic equivalent. The patient was forced to absorb the premium cost.
But the economic strain of those anti-substitution laws eventually became untenable. Beginning with Kentucky in 1972, states systematically repealed those bans to alleviate healthcare costs.
Which makes sense.
It does. However, empowering pharmacists to substitute drugs required a centralized, scientifically verified directory to ensure they weren't dispensing inferior copies. So the FDA responded by publishing the Orange Book, a continuously updated registry of approved drug products with therapeutic equivalence evaluations.
You can actually still download it as a very outdated iOS app today.
You can. The infrastructure for a generic market was finally taking shape.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Even with the Orange Book and the repeal of substitution bans, the pioneer companies still had a major legal weapon: patent enforcement. This generics company, Böhler Pharmaceuticals, operating in the early 1980s.
The Böhler lawsuit.
Yes, they were targeting Florazepam, a highly lucrative sleep aid patented by Roche. Böhler covertly acquired 5 kilograms of the active compound to initiate their generic formulation research, with the intent of submitting their generic application the exact day Roche's patent expired.
But Roche discovered the unauthorized procurement and immediately filed suit for patent infringement. Yes. The legal question was whether merely conducting laboratory research with a patented compound constituted infringement if the generic wasn't actually being sold yet. And the court sided with Roche.
Wow.
They ruled that utilizing the patented chemical for commercial research was a violation, which effectively weaponized the regulatory timeline against generics.
Because if the generic company has to wait until the exact day the patent expires just to begin their 2-year FDA approval process, the pioneer company is granted a de facto, unearned extension on their monopoly.
It completely paralyzed the generic pipeline. Recognizing the market failure, Congress negotiated the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984.
Universally known as the Hatch-Waxman Act.
Yes. This legislation is the bedrock of the modern pharmaceutical economy. It was a complex compromise. To appease the pioneer companies, the act granted up to 5 years of guaranteed data exclusivity, effectively restoring some of the monopoly time lost to FDA clinical trials. In exchange, it created a safe harbor provision for generic manufacturers, legally permitting them to utilize patented compounds for regulatory research while the pioneer patent was still active.
Wait, if you guarantee a pharmaceutical company a 5-year absolute monopoly on their clinical data, doesn't that just incentivize them to constantly make minor tweaks to their delivery mechanism to secure a new patent and block generics even longer?
That is a highly sophisticated critique, and it accurately describes a practice known today as evergreening. It is a persistent flaw in the system. But the trade-off in 1984 was deemed necessary because Hatch-Waxman fundamentally modernized how generics prove their worth. Literature reviews were no longer sufficient.
Right.
Generic manufacturers had to provide hard pharmacokinetic data proving bioequivalence. They were required to conduct focused human trials to measure 2 specific metrics against the brand name drug.
And this is the data that answers the core anxiety most people have about generics. How do these bioequivalence trials actually substitute for a decade of rigorous safety testing?
By analyzing how the human body metabolizes the molecule. The first metric is the area under the curve, or AUC, which measures the total systemic exposure, the absolute volume of the drug that successfully enters the bloodstream.
Okay.
The second metric is Cmax, which measures the maximum peak concentration of the drug in the blood over time. By proving the AUC and Cmax are statistically identical to the pioneer drug, scientists demonstrate that the generic molecule is unlocking the exact same cellular receptors at the exact same velocity as the brand name.
That's fascinating.
It renders long-term clinical trials redundant because human biology reacts to the molecular structure, not the trademark printed on the capsule.
That structural guarantee is incredible, but the legislation also included a bizarre financial incentive that nearly derailed the entire industry.
The 180-day exclusivity.
It's exactly. To motivate generic manufacturers to challenge weak patents and undertake these bioequivalence studies, Hatch-Waxman granted a 180-day exclusivity period to the very first generic company to successfully file an application. For 6 months, they would be the only generic on the market, allowing them to price their drug just nominally below the brand name and reap massive profits.
The economic gravity of that 180-day window was staggering. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars in revenue contingent on being first in the FDA's queue.
The regulatory bottleneck it created sounds absurd. Generic drug representatives literally camped on the steps of the FDA headquarters, physically clutching their applications, waiting for patents to expire.
It was a chaotic scene.
And the sheer amount of capital at stake inevitably invited corruption. The generic firm named Mylan, frustrated that their applications were mysteriously stalling while competitors breezed through the approval process, actually hired a private investigative firm in 1987 to surveil FDA personnel.
And that surveillance uncovered a deeply entrenched culture of systemic corruption within the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs. Government reviewers were actively accepting bribes, ranging from lavish dinners to direct financial kickbacks.
Just to prioritize specific applications and intentionally delay others.
Yes. The ensuing federal investigation implicated over 30 individuals across 9 separate pharmaceutical companies.
That level of institutional rot is catastrophic for public trust. Consumers were already predisposed to view generics with suspicion, and validating those fears with a literal bribery scandal required an immediate legislative response.
Which was the Generic Drug Enforcement Act of 1992.
Right. It instituted a policy of permanent debarment. If an executive or a company was caught tampering with the regulatory process, they were permanently exiled from the pharmaceutical industry.
While the legislative action cleansed the regulatory pipeline, rehabilitating the psychological damage within the consumer base remains an ongoing challenge.
Which brings up the obvious question we have to definitively answer for our listeners. Setting aside the historical corruption and the legal maneuvering, does the modern, heavily regulated generic market actually produce drugs that perform as well as the brand names?
The empirical data is definitive. A landmark 2009 meta-analysis published in the Journal of the American Medical Association reviewed 2 decades of clinical outcomes comparing generic and proprietary cardiovascular medications. The analysis found absolute therapeutic equivalence.
Wow.
Even when isolating drugs with incredibly narrow therapeutic indexes like warfarin, where minute fluctuations in blood concentration can trigger severe hemorrhaging or clotting, the generic formulations performed identically to the brand names.
That's reassuring.
A subsequent 2015 study in the European Journal of Epidemiology corroborated these findings, noting 0 statistically significant variation in adverse clinical events.
So what does this all mean? The pharmacokinetic data proves they work. Massive epidemiological studies verify the outcomes, yet a substantial segment of the population still fundamentally distrusts the cheaper bottle.
The psychological barrier is formidable because the patient experience isn't purely molecular. While the FDA mandates that the active pharmaceutical ingredient must be identical, the inactive ingredients, the excipients used for binding, coloring, or flavoring, are permitted to vary.
Oh, right.
Consequently, a generic pill might possess a different shape, a slightly altered taste profile, or it might dissolve on the tongue at a marginally different rate than the brand name the patient is accustomed to.
And people notice that.
Exactly. These formulation variances have 0 impact on the drug's systemic efficacy, but to a patient experiencing illness, any sensory deviation is inherently perceived as a potential risk. Trust is an incredibly fragile commodity in healthcare.
The mechanics of how those pills are actually synthesized today adds another layer of complexity to that trust. Because when we look at the modern landscape, the geographical reality of drug manufacturing has shifted entirely.
Mm.
The FDA physically cannot inspect every production line, so they rely heavily on global regulatory harmonization.
They have to.
An astounding 72% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients consumed in the United States are synthesized overseas. The supply chain is heavily distributed, with 26% originating in Europe, 18% in India, and 13% in China.
It represents a total restructuring of the pharmaceutical ecosystem. Consider the trajectory. In 1983, immediately prior to the passage of Hatch-Waxman, generic drugs accounted for a mere 13% of total U.S. prescriptions. Today, that figure stands at 90%.
90%.
The overwhelming majority of modern healthcare runs on generic compounds. However, that remaining 10% of brand-name prescriptions consumes a massive 74% of total pharmaceutical spending.
That is wild.
We continue to see egregious exploitations of the market, such as Turing Pharmaceuticals acquiring the rights to Daraprim and immediately escalating the price from $13.50 to $750 a tablet.
The regulatory framework is clearly far from perfect.
It is. But Hatch-Waxman undeniably established a pathway that has saved the global economy trillions of dollars.
It's a remarkable evolution from the era of patent medicines and snake oil to a highly regulated, albeit imperfect, global infrastructure.
This raises an important question, however.
Yeah.
We just established that 90% of the pharmaceutical lifeline we rely on is generic, and 72% of the core active ingredients required to manufacture that lifeline are sourced internationally. We exist in a state of profound dependency on a harmonized global supply chain.
Right?
So if geopolitical relations fracture, or if a localized disruption, be it a trade dispute or an environmental crisis, severely impacts those concentrated manufacturing hubs in India or China, the vulnerability of our healthcare infrastructure becomes glaringly apparent. How resilient is that generic pipeline if the global network fundamentally breaks down?
Man, that is a sobering structural reality to evaluate the next time you're standing in the pharmacy aisle comparing those price tags. We've navigated an immense amount of history and science today, tracing the evolution of intellectual property and public health. We hope this deep dive equipped you with a sharper, more analytical perspective on the medication sitting in your cabinet. Keep interrogating the systems around you and stay curious. See you next time.